Hello and welcome to today's Global Construction Outlook, discussing wage growth, labor shortages, and implications. My name is Rory King, Director of IHS Supply Chain, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's event. Today's event is hosted by IHS, the leading provider of global supply chain information and analytics, and it will focus on insight from the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service. Used by organizations around the world, the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service equips clients with vital market, price, and cost information to help them make informed sourcing and procurement decisions and recognize millions of dollars in cost savings. Thank you so much for attending today. We're pleased to have you join us. Before we get started, I'd like to familiarize you with today's webcast by covering a few housekeeping items. We want this to be an informative event, so feel free to ask a question at any time. To do so, type your question into the Ask a Question area to your right and click Submit. The slides will advance automatically for you throughout the event, and if you need help at any time, click the Help icon to the below right corner of your screen. And feel free to join the conversation today on Twitter. Follow us at IHS4Supply Chain and join us in live tweeting by using the hashtag IHS Webcast. That's IHS Webcast, singular. And finally, we have created a survey with questions about today's events and topics. Your feedback is very instrumental to us in helping improve our market knowledge, products and services, and event performance. As a token of our appreciation, IHS is offering everyone who completes today's survey a chance to win a Kindle Fire HD. Please complete the survey, which can be found also at the bottom of the webcast console via the survey icon shown on your screen. And if you leave today's webcast early for any reason, please do quickly let us know why in the survey so that we may continuously improve our events. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. I'm pleased today to introduce Emily Crowley, who is economist at the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Group. We will hear from her first, and she currently works in the North American Labor Division, specializing in wages and assisting in the global manufacturing and global construction compensation reports. She is a graduate of George Washington University, where she earned a BA in Economics and International Affairs with a concentration in International Economics. Welcome, Emily. Next, we will be joined by Laura Hodges, who is the Director of the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service. Laura covers the analysis and forecast of the global labor and healthcare costs. She has spoken extensively on the topic of the global cost environment, including a recent presentation at the Institute of Supply Management and the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering Conference. She received her MBA from Rutgers University in Beijing, China, and her MA in Health and Labor Economics from Duke University. Welcome, Laura. And with that, we'll hear first from Emily. Take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Rory. As Rory mentioned, thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to be able to give this presentation with my colleague, Laura Hodges. We're going to address a question that we hear very often from clients in the labor side of the pricing and purchasing service, which is really, where is there a skilled labor shortage? Is there one? And if so, how do we deal with it? How do we avoid the cost increases associated with labor market tightness? Before we begin, I'm just going to go over our agenda very quickly to give you an idea of where we're going to go with our presentation. I'm going to start off with a quick discussion of where are we now, what are we seeing in labor markets, and why. I'm going to then move on to what are the primary drivers of wage growth. What does the future hold for these wage drivers? I'll then pass off the presentation to my colleague Laura Hodges, who's going to discuss some of the hotspots that we're experiencing. The two focuses we're going to see are United States and Canada. These are regions that currently are experiencing labor shortages and stronger wage growth, and we're going to go into how they're actually dealing with it. We're then going to apply the knowledge that we instill through the discussion of primary drivers on where we can expect stronger wage growth. And then finally, we'll go into our global labor cost outlook. Before I begin, as Rory mentioned, I'd like to stress that this is primarily we're going to be talking about global construction markets but much of what we say can be applied to other industries. The three takeaways that we'd like you to get from this presentation, the first is that demand is strong, but is concentrated in certain regions and sectors. Supply is available, but again, in regions of strong demand, supply over the near term will be tight. And finally, sourcing workers is possible, but it may mean going to other regions to recruit workers. It may mean developing long-term training programs, and it also may mean paying above average wages over the near term. So what do we mean by skilled labor? This might be a silly question, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Generally, when we talk about skilled labor, and again, we are focusing on the construction industry, we're discussing occupations that require advanced training, several years of on-the-job experience, or certification. So oftentimes we think of occupations including welders, pipe fitters, electricians, and boilermakers, but this also extends to project managers and engineers. The reason why these areas are so important is because they're really that the skilled trades are very necessary to be able to actually complete a project. Not only that, they account for 40% of employment, but they do account for 60% of your payroll spend. So any sort of strong wage escalation has a direct impact on your bottom line. We have been hearing more and more instances of labor shortages popping up in the news, which is one of the reasons why we'd like to tackle this subject right now. We do not expect a repeat of the 2009 shortages. However, we do expect to experience areas of regional tightness. We're starting to see that now. According to a manpower survey in 2012, 34% of employers were reporting difficulty filling jobs. Again, that's across all industries, not just the construction industry, but it is an uptake from 2009, the low levels we experienced right after the recession, but it's still down from the high experienced in 2007 at 41%. What we are seeing more and more is that skills trades are topping that talent shortage list. Again, this isn't necessarily a global condition. A lot of it is very regional. Some countries are experiencing double-digit wage growth due to shortages, and this is resulting in cost overruns. It can result in project delays and cancellations, but that isn't necessarily the condition around the world. Understanding the drivers of wage growth can allow cost estimators to identify potential skill shortages and plan accordingly. So we're going to go over some of those regional drivers. The main takeaway is if you aren't concerned about shortages, we would argue that tightening labor markets should be on your radar, as we expect regional shortages to persist. This is a graph of the same manpower data I just referenced, and this is the percentage of global firms reporting shortages. The gray bars are actually the global numbers, and we can see those broken out in a regional level in the colored lines. And generally, we can see that global wage shortages are starting to, or tightness is starting to return to markets. Again, we're at about 34% of employers are reporting difficulty filling jobs. But when we look at the regional level, we can really see three different stories. In the Americas, things got better. Well, I mean, not got better, but things are starting to tighten once again from the 2008 low we saw. The same can be said for APAC, which is also escalating fairly quickly. And then EMEA is the downside of this, and a lot of that's tied to economic conditions in the regions, with the Eurozone experiencing a double-dip recession, which is holding back a lot of demand for skilled labor. So what does shortages mean, and what does tightness mean for wage escalation? Well, to understand wage escalation, we have to understand, again, the fundamental drivers. When we think of wage growth, we think of it in terms of the same way we would in prices. We look at baseline inflation and then supply and demand conditions. Inflation sets the floor for wage growth. As inflation goes, so do wages. But an understanding of the inflationary environment can be key to identifying strengthening fundamentals, because oftentimes areas of high inflation can actually mask either weak or strong fundamentals. Finally, supply and demand balance are that will help determine wage growth on top of or below of wage escalation. And really what's driving supply and demand balance is who in the labor negotiations actually have the power. If you're in a condition where supply is outpacing demand, that's a condition where you're going to have wage power in the hands of employers, and lower wage growth, and of course vice versa is when demand starts outpacing supply is when you'll see stronger wage growth due to market's inability to actually to fill all of the positions demanded by employers. Just to do a brief demonstration of why inflation is important to understand, I've pulled the extreme case of Venezuela. In general, when we think of inflation, or when we think of wage growth, at least for me, and I again forecast wages in North America, if I saw 20% wage growth, I would be shocked. And my gut feeling would be that this clearly indicates an area of very, very tight markets. But when we look at Venezuelan wage growth compared to inflation in the region, we can see that the strong inflation rate has actually masked some areas of weakness. In general, wages have been growing around 25% over the past 7 years, and inflation has actually been growing at about 27%. So you can see between 2008 and 2010, there were actually some potentials for labor cost savings where wages were growing slower than inflation. So this is just a demonstration of to be aware of your inflationary environment in the regions in which you're operating and hiring. Again, this is another inflation graph. It shows average inflation between 2006 and 2012 and our expectations going forward. You can see the general trend is that developing countries will experience lower inflation. You can see the United States pegged around 2% with Canada and Germany slightly lower. And then as we move towards emerging economies, that inflation rate gets a little bit higher. So when you look at an emerging economy and you see strong wage growth, that doesn't necessarily mean stronger fundamental wages. It may just indicate the stronger inflationary environment. So when we get to the fundamentals, and again, fundamentals are what will actually impact your real wage growth, or that's wage growth outside of the inflationary environment, what actually drives it? One of the primary drivers that I've already mentioned is demand. When we talk about demand, we really are thinking about 4 key things. The first is project investment. Project investment is pretty much one of the key indicators that we look at as it shows us how much money, how much investment is going forward. Unfortunately, project investment varies. It's highly volatile. We can't just assume that every project that's announced is actually going to go forward. Instead, we have to consider business cycles, commodity prices, and global demand. When we think back to the super cycle leading up to the recession, that was an area of very strong project investment. A lot of that was driven by strong global demand and high commodity prices, which made a lot of projects profitable. Outside of project investment, we also have to consider labor requirements. And labor requirements include the type and the size of the project. And these 2 factors will determine the actual makeup of the construction labor that will be needed to complete each project. So we can think of, a smaller mine will need fewer employees versus a very large, high-tech mine is going to require a lot of employees, but also many more on the skilled side. Finally, productivity. Productivity is one of the hot questions we continue to get. It has the potential to offset demand growth and can be a source of cost savings. Unfortunately, it does vary by project and type of project moving forward. So we can expect in areas of new technologies, productivity might actually be lower. Typically, you associate technology with high productivity, but there is a learning curve, and one of the obstacles of implementing new technology is that you just don't have that deep pool of experienced workers that are trained on it. So it can be a near-term hindrance, but down the road it will help boost productivity. And then finally, employment pull from other sectors. And I'd just like to highlight this quickly because this is one of the reasons that we don't see wage escalation peaking the way that it did in the pre-recession before and in the pre-recession period of growth, and most of this is determined by the fact that not all industries are accelerating at the same rate. Some industries are doing much better, some industries are still slow to declining, and this also varies by what country you're operating in or the region in which you operate. One of the sectors that we continue to hear a lot of feedback from is the oil and gas sector. And especially when we talk about skilled wages, this is probably where most of our questions come in. And it's kind of easy, looking at this graph, and this graph again is more project investment. This is global CAPEX spending in the oil and gas sector. We can really see that running up to the recession, this is when we saw the very prevalent labor shortages for skilled occupations. CAPEX spending was peaking, about 25 to 26% per year between 2005 almost through 2008. So that's in very strong growth. And you can imagine with that much money being spent on projects, it had an equally strong effect on demand and pulling workers into the sector to be able to finish these projects. And we were also hearing a lot of news reports about labor shortages surrounding that time period. Of course, between 2008 and 2010, we were in a recession. No one was spending any money, so there really wasn't this idea or concern about labor shortages. But as the global economy starts improving, as commodity prices have rebounded, we've seen a re-acceleration in a lot of this CAPEX spending, especially in the oil and gas. But you can see, if you look at the red line, and the red line is the average CAPEX growth per year, we're not going to get back to those 25% levels. We peaked slightly in 2011. We're going to downtrend a little bit to 15% growth. So that's by no means weak, but it's strong enough to support demand, but it's not at those pre-recession levels. Unfortunately, the level of spending, or fortunately, depending on what industry you are in, the level of spending will remain quite high, and it's enough to support continued demand growth in the oil and gas sector. What does this mean? Well, it means that in the construction sector, because many of these projects are so capital intensive, there's so much construction activity going on, and they're very skilled worker intensive, it means that other sectors are also going to be feeling some of this tightness that's being pulled forward by oil and gas spending. Much of the spending, again, is going to be in unconventional projects. Unconventional projects, because of their nature, have a higher skilled labor requirements, which increases the base labor demands in skilled markets. They're also located in remote locations, which means a smaller labor force to begin with. So if one of these major projects is going in an area where the employment or the labor force is quite small, it's going to have a huge impact, and it's going to drive up wages very quickly. And then I've already mentioned how the new technologies that are going forward can actually limit near-term productivity growth, just given the fact that there isn't that deep pool of skilled laborers that have experience. However, down the road, projects will benefit as more workers are pulled into the labor market to meet the demand of these projects. But even in the oil and gas sector, you can see that there are regional differences. Not every region is going to be accelerating in that 15% growth area down the road. We can see that Asia Pacific is one of the areas where we expect a significant slowdown, whereas Africa is one of the areas that will experience an increase. Again, the levels in Africa of actual spending are quite low, but that is an area that's going to be driving demand growth. The Middle East as well, the Iraqi oil production that's coming online is going to support some strong labor demand in the oil and gas section. Same with Latin America. The amount of discovery going on in the deep salts off the coast of Brazil will help support demand for skilled laborers in those regions, which will probably be pulling workers from other countries. So we've done a brief discussion of of how money is spent. What does that mean for demand? What types of projects are going forward? Are they labor intensive? Are they not labor intensive? Do they have strong skilled baseline demand? But that's still only part of the picture. The other part that is key to understanding how labor supply is going to be affected and whether we're going to experience tightness is the supply side. It's the last key determinant. When we discuss labor supply, we think of the size of the available labor force, and this means how large is the labor force. That can be affected by, what's the actual population of the country, what does participation for men look like, what does participation for women look like. It also, for long-term labor force markets, it's influenced by demographic trends. So in general, we think of population growth as positive, to slowing in the developed world, accelerating in the emerging world, but there are a few exceptions. And finally, also it's affected by socioeconomic trends, which includes education and tertiary education rates, which are key to skilled labor market supply. When we're looking for indicators of the supply side, we generally look at the unemployment rate. And unemployment, of course, is a measure of labor force availability. But it's also an indicator of supply and demand fundamentals if you look at it over a long period of time. And it's especially valuable in emerging markets, and I'll go into that in a bit. Other factors that contribute to supply movements, and this is the movements of workers into and out of the skilled labor force, includes this concept of return on investment. And that's simply that with any sort of expenditure, you're weighing what you'll actually get in return for that transaction. So in the case of a skilled labor market, and this might be a little bit foreign, you weigh what you expect to return in wages, hopefully stronger wages, against the cost and the time required to actually fulfill your training or achieve your certificate. With higher wages, of course, pulling more people into the labor market, and lower wages discouraging entrance into the labor market. This is also true on the back end, and I mentioned this, and Laura will go into it in her presentation, is it also influences the decision to stay in the skilled labor force versus retiring, which we're seeing a bunch in the United States, where a lot of the skilled labor force is actually aging out of the workforce, but is deciding to stay in for a few more years just because wages are so high. And then finally, another impact to supply is regulations, which includes immigration policies, streamlining skilled worker visas, which we've been seeing in Canada, Australia, and maybe to a certain extent the United States, depending on the immigration policy that's being discussed right now. Again, I've mentioned unemployment as a measure of tightness. This is just an exercise that we do as economists. Is we compare the current employment levels to the 5-year average as an indicator of market tightness. And you can see in this slide that really the countries that start popping out include Brazil, Germany, and Peru. And emerging economies, oftentimes you will see employment fall below the 5-year average. And this should always raise a red flag as a potential area of shortages. And finally, demographic trends. I mentioned that there is one exception to stronger stronger population growth, and that's really China. China's the outlier here. Because of their two-child policy, they're actually going to experience a declining labor force over the next 10 years. And as a region with actually relatively low unemployment, that means a significant tightening of markets. China typically we think of as almost a wage export or a labor exporter, so that might actually change. And if you have a very large project you would like to move forward in China, it's important to understand that the abundant labor force that we assume is there, that's not necessarily going to be there forever. Again, Europe and North America, generally population growth there is more stable, but Europe is also shrinking. It's only going to grow 4% over the next 10 years, which is fairly weak. And of course, the emerging markets are much more robust in their labor force growth. So we've covered some of the key drivers of demand and supply. I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague Laura who's going to apply our research of these fundamentals to determine regions of possible labor market tightness. Laura?
Thank you, Emily. As she just mentioned, I do want to apply these factors that she just went over for wage growth and highlight regions globally that we feel are poised for growth and potential shortages in the future. But first, I want to break things up a little bit and poll the audience. I want to see what you think. So take a minute or 30 seconds or so to answer the following question. Do you think the U.S. Gulf Coast has the tightest market for skilled labor? Yes, no, or unsure. I do realize that some of you may not even be operating in this region, so unsure might be the appropriate answer here. But please take a couple seconds and give your answer. I will mention, and Rory mentioned it earlier, Emily and I are part of IHS's global labor cost team, where we are constantly monitoring, analyzing, and forecasting global labor trends as part of our day-to-day job. We get a lot of questions in from clients. That's what we love most. And two of the more popular questions right now have been on the U.S. and Canada. This is really in stark contrast to just a year ago when Australia seemed to be on everyone's mind. But with some of that pressure coming off, with the mining sector subsiding there a bit, plus some productivity advances, clients have turned their focus back to the U.S. and more particularly the U.S. Gulf Coast, which is one of the reasons why I asked this question today. So without further ado, I'm going to click over and see how we scored. Results have still not been published. There we go. Let me see if I can push this to the audience. Preview window only. Poll results have not been pushed to the audience. Is that something my folks online? Great. Thank you. So you should now be seeing the results quickly. And conveniently enough, it sounds like a third. A third of you have answered yes. A third no, a little bit less than that. And some of you are not sure, maybe just operating outside of the United States. Fair enough. So this sort of sets the stage for the next few slides. I do want to try to convince you that the U.S. is one of the tighter labor markets that we are facing right now. And with that, I'm going to flip over to my next slide. If I can. There we go. All right. So we tagged the U.S. Gulf Coast as an emerging hotspot, and this actually might be a little misleading given that the labor markets have been a topic of concern for the past decade, starting with Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. So I should have probably titled this slide Escalating. Might have been a better fit, and it's really due to two factors, common factors as economists, Emily and I are, supply and demand. Demand we do expect to remain strong. High oil prices will continue. Although we do see prices for oil pulling back closer to $90 a barrel over the next year, we do think that this is high enough to push projects forward. Also, cheap shale gas is going to encourage other projects over the next few years. In fact, IHS Chemicals estimates that downstream projects will deliver $100 billion in CAPEX over the next decade. So additionally, supply of the workers is tight in there. The U.S. construction sector overall is beginning to rebound, some parts of the U.S. a little bit more than others, as you'll see in the next slide. And also we have seen a slowdown in apprenticeships enrollments, meaning that supply is certainly beginning to tighten. So we are expecting above average wage growth for skilled trade professionals, as defined by Emily earlier on. We expect wages to increase about 5% plus over 2016 annually. So let's get into talk a little bit further about the supply situation in the Gulf Coast and more broadly the United States. The U.S. Construction sector lost more than 30% of its workforce during the recession. Now, while I just mentioned it is beginning to claw its way back, this does represent a huge hole in its own set of problems once the recovery swings into full gear. But the situation in the Gulf Coast is a little unique compared to the rest of the country. In this first slide up on the upper left-hand side, we're looking at percentage of workforce lost from 2006, which we view as the peak of construction markets in most areas of the United States, versus right now. And what you can see is that construction employment in the U.S. Gulf Coast is only 4% off of its 2006 peak, compared to nationally being 30% below the peak level. Big difference there, and one that definitely does say tighter labor market in the Gulf Coast region. Just as an FYI for those that are operating on the U.S. West Coast, this does represent our weakest region, with the percent of workforce lost currently still at 41%. So still a lot of workers to pull back into the labor force, or to really to work for you. So in the second slide, you're seeing that not a lot of students are entering vocational schools, which is the first step to increasing the supply of welders, electricians, pipe fitters, your skilled labor force. You can look across the timeline here since the year 2000. We've seen about a 20% increase in the number of people over 25 who've completed a 2-year vocational program. This compares to a 40+% increase in college graduates. We do hope to see this rise soon as the cost of higher education continues to explode and salaries for the skilled workers rise. But so far we've yet to see that really in the numbers of vocational school completion. So now let's break down that first chart I just showed a little bit further. This time we're showing which states have potentially the tightest market. Calculated again as the peak to current employment, with higher meaning tighter. You can see that the middle part of the country and even New England are some of the tighter markets in the United States. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you should not have any problems finding workers in such places, the lighter areas, which are Florida, Nevada, and other parts of the West Coast. So besides slower vocational enrollment, demographics are also working against us, with the existing skilled workforce aging. Here you're looking at some data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's showing that the average age over the last 10 years has increased. Not a surprise, increased about 2 years from about 38 to 41. And even more alarming is the share of workforce over 45. So again, for welders, pipe fitters, electrician, your skilled labor force, we see back in 2000, only 30% of the workforce was over 45, and now it's up to 40%. So, I should note, that this is not necessarily unique to the United States. Emily did show a slide just a few seconds ago about demographics. Germany, Japan, other industrialized nations are certainly facing some of the same challenges. But given some of the demand pressures that myself and Emily have just laid out, we do think it's a little bit more pressing here. And we need to reverse these trends if the United States is really going to be able to realize all of their investment ambitions. So let's talked a lot about the U.S. or the Gulf Coast, but there's also pockets across the U.S. that are struggling to find workers, led primarily, again, by the oil and gas sector. Here I've listed the top oil and gas towns across the United States with their current and 5-year average unemployment rate. And I think Emily gave some statistics on a good benchmark. I'm also going to throw out there that an unemployment rate less than 4% certainly signals a tight market. And as you can see, the first few on this list are meeting that mark. What I really want you to take away from this slide is that those first few cities, if you're towns, if you're operating in those areas, there's not a lot you can do. There's not a lot of idle workers hanging out in these cities. you're going to have to be not only constantly recruiting, but also looking outside of your region, your state, your area. But on the flip side, not all of these oil markets, all oil cities, oil and gas cities are tight. And training is certainly an option with some of the areas like Pascagoula and Bakersville. There are idle workers. Training is an option, and you should be encouraging your employer to do such, to find these workers. So let's move over to our second hotspot, which is Alberta, Canada. And here we have classified this region as potentially cooling. Similar to the United States, we've had strong demand over the past decade. Development of the Alberta oil sands has driven up CAPEX spending, averaging over 8% annual growth rates for the past decade. Remote project locations and their large labor requirements made it not necessarily the easiest environment to operate on, and additionally, they don't really have a huge labor pool to draw upon. This has supported an average construction wage growth of over 5% for the past 6 years. But I say cooling because while we do expect investment in this region to continue, the days of strong acceleration in CAPEX are over. And Canada has been doing a great job at advertising its tough labor market situation for several years now, and it's led to more action. They've begun bringing in more temporary foreign workers, and they're training Canadians to fill in the gaps to help alleviate these shortages. So some good programs to start tackling this problem. And let's take a little bit of a look at the numbers, put some numbers behind the statements I just made. In the first graph you can see, Canada has more than doubled its skill and technical population through their temporary foreign worker program since 2009, led by Alberta. And even more encouraging is the increase in apprentice training shown in the second slide that has really pushed apprentice training higher in the country. Now, for these reasons, we do feel that Canada might be cooling in terms of a region of labor shortages and strong wage growth. But there are a couple of risks to this outlook. There is an increasing labor pool from other provinces that didn't exist just a couple of years ago. The Hebron oil project in the eastern part of the country, as well as the BHP potash project in Saskatchewan, could potentially pull labor from the western Alberta Canadian region. And also, while I've spoke well about their new immigration policies, there's been a fair amount of public backlash of these new policies. So this is a region to keep your eye on. Keep your eye on the news, keep your eye on the labor data, and really figure out whether they've moved past an area of true shortage. So I've walked through a couple of regions that we feel deserve special mention due to the strong demand growth. But now I want to turn back to the factors that Emily laid out earlier and present a framework for estimating future skilled labor shortage. And unfortunately for us here, there's not necessarily a magic data set that tracks explicitly the supply and demand of skilled workers globally, particularly in emerging markets. So we needed to rely on Emily's factors or leading indicators to help get us there. So what we did, we selected 20 countries from around the world and compiled estimates on employment growth, unemployment rates, CAPEX growth, and educational capacity in each of these countries. Then we took a look at the experience over the last 3 years for each of these components and compared it to the global average to understand if the labor market conditions were tight or not. And the results lay before you in this spectrum of shortage, and then on the going over to the right-hand side, we're labeling it not a problem. So not necessarily that surprising. The upper half of the spectrum where we identify it at risk for a shortage, it's dominated by the emerging markets. And the lower half dominated by the developed world. But there are some exceptions to highlight here. We have Norway in the upper half at risk, and this is really due to their first of all, an extremely low unemployment rate, but also due to its strong oil and gas sector. And one that did jump out as a surprise to me, at least, on the not a problem side was Poland. This is still a developing market, but it's one that has an extremely wonderful educational capacity. They turn out a lot of engineers, a lot of technical students from their programs, and therefore the educational capacity in this country is exceptional. So that really, and additionally it was combined with a relatively stable unemployment growth, employment growth, unemployment rate, and CAPEX growth. So that's really what pushed it off to the side. So for factors on the good side for everyone everyone on the phone call today. And then we have Indonesia and Peru at the top end of the list. So why did Indonesia and Peru pop out as the most at-risk countries? Well, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world in terms of population, but only about a fifth or a quarter of the population has attained a higher educational or a technical skilled background. Also, it has a low and falling unemployment rate. And due to recent market reforms, the country has really pulled itself together, and strong investment in economic growth has flowed in. Peru, for some of the same reasons that we just mentioned for Indonesia, pulled it to the top spot as well. This was the country with the strongest investment growth of the 20 that we looked at, 40% in the last 3 years. The country is rich in natural resources, which is part of the reason for the strong investment growth. And it also has a falling unemployment rate, compounded, though, with a relatively small labor force, not a lot of workers to draw upon. Finally, it does have a relatively stable government and pro-business environment, which also, again, supported the strong investment growth. So those two did pop up to the top. So what has this meant for our wage growth? Ultimately, Emily and I's day-to-day job is forecasting wages. We look at all the factors, but what we really need to do is put a number to wage growth for countries around the world. And here, what you're looking at is skilled trade wage growth by country. I should note, anything in 2012 and before we consider historical, but 2013 and beyond is our estimate, is our forecast. I should also note that these wages are expressed as a percent change in local currency and are nominal, meaning that inflation has not been stripped out. So what I want you to concentrate on is the last column. That is the annual average annual growth rate from over the next 4 years, from 2013 to 16. Indonesia and Peru, for a lot of the reasons I just mentioned, are among the countries with the highest growth rate at 10.4% annually over the next 4 years, and for Peru at a little bit over 7%. Other countries with strong growth rates, not a surprise, are the emerging markets. They have significant infrastructure spending coming on board, as well as often stronger inflation. So that lifts your wage rate, as Emily outlined earlier. So speaking of which, what the countries that we would really point to for the strongest real wage growth, the ones that are really going to impact your bottom line, is going to be in Brazil, China, Indonesia, Peru, and Russia. So I think all of you are probably sitting there wondering, okay, so I spent the first half of my presentation talking about U.S. and Canada, but they didn't have huge wage growth, and they didn't necessarily top the charts in terms of being at risk for a labor shortage. And that's really, there's a few reasons for that. Nationally, so looking across the entire United States or the entire country of Canada, national demand trends aren't necessarily as robust as what we outlined for Alberta and the Gulf Coast. So you need to look at regional and sector trends to pick up on that activity, labor market tightness, and accordingly, higher wage growth. Emily and I are both often asked if we think we're going to return back to the situation where these two countries in 2007 and 2008 experienced close to or at 10% wage growth. As you can see in our forecast, we don't think we are going to relive those days over the next few years. And there's a few reasons for that. From what we're seeing, employers are still very cautious. They talk about a tight labor market, but they're cautiously hiring. They want a qualified worker. They're not taking in any worker like they were back in 2007. We also have pockets of growth, and not all regions and sectors are operating at full speed, as we did back in 2007 and 8. Workers in some areas might be harder to find, but if you're willing to look, if you're willing to move, they are available. But we have highlighted a couple of areas, demographics and supply, which could be a bit of a risk to our outlook here. So 2 areas certainly to watch as things that could derail our outlook. So if you are operating in some of those areas, what can be done to help with these shortages? Number one, you can probably imagine what I'm going to say next, is recruiting more aggressively in countries with less demand. And there's certainly a few that come immediately to mind. Last year we looked at recent visa applications from both Canada and Australia and found a significant number of applicants were from Europe. Ireland and UK stood out because of the language skills, but generally due to poor economic conditions in that region, Europe, which we expect not just now but into the near future, you have many people looking for work, willing to work, and willing to move. Spain's youth unemployment now stands at over 50%, and construction labor force was booming right up into the crash, meaning there's a lot of underutilized idle workers. So while moving folks from different countries is not necessarily the ideal solution, and it is risky, it is a strong, viable option, and one that did not necessarily exist back in 2007 because all regions, all countries were really operating at this full gear, this full speed. So this is an option now that you didn't have before. Other options we've seen clients use, exploring off-site construction, prefab, engineering services off-site. Potentially think of Poland in the future for engineering services. Language barriers might exist, but they certainly have the capacity. Invest in training or establish local training programs. Canada has done a great job at advertising its problem, and I really think that the U.S. needs to follow. Finally, it goes without saying, offering higher supplemental pay instead of higher base pay. I think this has worked in the favor of Australia more recently. As the mining industry moved back quickly, so has their wages because of that flexibility. So in conclusion, sourcing skilled workers is going to be difficult and expensive, but it's not a problem everywhere. You need to keep your eye on factors such as supply, demand, inflation, that has signaled higher wages in the past, tight labor markets, and monitor them. Particularly CAPEX. We love CAPEX. If you can get your hands on good CAPEX data, it's a great leading indicator for where wages are heading in the future. We highlighted Canadian oil sands and U.S. Gulf Coast as regions that are struggling with the availability of skilled workers. But at least in the case of Canada, we feel like those supply issues have been eased. For those operating globally, it may be difficult to source skilled workers also in Indonesia and Peru. Finding skilled and qualified workers will be a challenge, and therefore we need creative solutions, and I've tried to offer a few here today. Bottom line is that you need to be prepared, monitor key drivers, and understand when future wage pressures are going to hit. So with that, I'm going to move over to one last slide before I hand it over to Rory with some closing remarks and Q&A. I did want to highlight those that are on the phone that are current clients. We have an upcoming 7th annual Pricing and Purchasing Seminar in downtown Chicago on September 24th. It's an all-day seminar where we go over our outlook really for materials, wages, services, really across the supply chain, where prices and wages are moving in the year ahead. Been doing this for 7 years now in the Chicago region, and I hope at least for clients who do have 2 complimentary passes, we'll see many of you there. I think we have a website listed here that you can visit and register. And with that, I do want to hand things back over to Rory. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Excellent presentation, both you and Emily. So with that, I'd like the audience to take a look at their screen while I ask that Laura and Emily take a look at the numerous questions that have come in to familiarize themselves with them before we get started with Q&A. So we'll be taking audience questions right now, feeding those into Laura and Emily. And as a reminder, you can ask a question using the Ask a Question dialog box on the front of your screen. Right now, I'd like you to take a look at the survey icon that you see. I believe it's the third from the right at the bottom of your screen. I want to remind everybody that we are very interested in your feedback on this event and the topics that we shared. Did you find today's presentation informative? What labor and wage issues are top of mind at your organization? And how we can continue to improve these events are all things that we would like you to provide your feedback on via the survey. So again, see the survey icon at the bottom of your screen, and please take an opportunity now or towards the end of the event to fill that out for us, and we greatly appreciate it. As mentioned earlier, that everyone will be entered into the drawing for a Kindle Fire HD. I'd also like to point out that everybody here has an opportunity to take advantage of a complimentary offering from IHS to receive our weekly Pricing Pulse newsletter. It provides timely commodity prices, analysis, and commentary from IHS economists and commodity price forecasting experts like Laura and Emily on the issues that we shared today and many, many more. So to receive this newsletter, please indicate your interest by completing the survey, where you'll see an opportunity to express your interest in receiving this newsletter, or you may also email us at webcasts, plural, at ihs.com. My apologies, that's webcasts at ihs.com. Please indicate the subject line Pricing Pulse so that we know how to direct your request. So with that, please submit your questions and we'll get started. We have a lot of questions here, so we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. So we have a first question here for Emily. Emily, how long does a training program take to bring a newly trained skilled worker up to par in terms of productivity?
It's really dependent on the type of skilled labor you're sourcing. In general, it takes about 3 to 4 years of training and on-the-job experience to actually get to the foreman level, which is important to keep in mind because that means that there is a 4-year lead time to bringing people online. So if you'd like to set up a training program, it means that you're not going to be able to see those impacts immediately. To get to on par in terms of productivity, I assume that you mean at an average productivity level of any other worker. Even after those 4 years, it'll still take a few years of experience to work out some of the kinks and come up in terms of the other experienced laborers on a project.
Great, thank you. Laura, we have a question for you, and it came in the context of your discussion on global shortages and the global wage outlook. We had a question specifically about Japan. Any comments on Japan?
Japan has obviously been struggling, not just recently, but really over the past couple of decades in terms of their economy, their economic growth, and wage growth has certainly followed. It is a country that's going through its own set of structural changes. I hope that even more come with regards to labor markets so they can be more ready to change with the economic environment. That said, I have not seen anything in terms of shortages, labor market pressures coming out of that country for quite some time. There was a bit of a concern after the nuclear crisis in 2011, but we haven't really seen that come to bear. So it is, we did have that for a risk in terms of, specifically what we're talking about here, construction wages, and more importantly, skilled laborers. But again, I think that it's an economy that it struggled. The unemployment rate doesn't typically high just because of the way their markets are structured, but the labor force, the wage outlook has not necessarily moved at all either, and really has tagged next to inflation for quite some time now.
Great, thank you, Laura. This is next is a very astute and interesting observation and question for Emily. Emily, there's been a big rise in the share of the workforce over 45, but the average itself hasn't risen that much. Could this imply that a lot of young and potentially inexperienced persons are entering the workforce, which is keeping the average down? In other words, that maybe the 35 to 40 range is missing. Any comments?
Yes, it's a good observation. Unfortunately, that's not what appears to be happening. During the recession, a lot of these industries were gutted, which actually took out the 30 to 45, maybe not the 30 to 45, but the 25 to probably 35 age group out. We saw a significant reduction in that, and it also lowered employment across the board. So unfortunately, it's just those two actions taking place. It doesn't look like a significant increase in average wage, but 2 years is actually, when you do the math, it is pretty significant considering all of the age groups that you would expect to move through. It's like moving up the pig through the python is kind of what we're seeing, is like there's just more people moving into that older age bracket, and we aren't seeing those younger employees moving from the bottom up to help advance the workforce flow or help fill the pipeline that we're going to see, a lot of these older workers exit actually over the long term or even near term, honestly. We have also seen a fairly large increase in the number of over 45, but not even over 45, like over 55 and over 60 employees. So.
Okay, thanks, Emily. I'm going to, again, just remind everybody, as you see on the screen, please take a look at filling out the survey. We'd appreciate everyone's input, and if you haven't, I just want to make a quick reminder to everyone to fill out the survey. So I have another question here for Laura. Laura, you mentioned less difficulty in finding workers on the West Coast of the U.S., but I'm having problems filling jobs. Why should I experience that kind of problem or situation?
I think in the near term, the market just dropped so much. I quoted for the West Coast down 41% of the workforce from where it once stood back in 2006. Obviously, all those folks aren't sitting on unemployment, and so they've had to find other jobs. I do think temporarily when a market starts coming back, which we are starting to see construction come back, not just on the West Coast, but across the United States on the residential side, it could impart some temporary shortages while those workers that used to be in construction, they might be working healthcare, they might be working manufacturing, they went to other jobs. You might see some temporary tightness, but I wouldn't be fooled by it. And maybe just waiting and really recruiting and advertising your positions will pull people, I guess might be the better word to use, pull people back into the construction workforce. But don't be fooled by it. It shouldn't be there. Not only is the construction market having its own sense of issues on the West Coast, but the unemployment rate across California and other countries are also some of the highest. So don't be fooled by it.
Great. Thanks, Laura. At this point, I'll ask Laura and Emily. I see just a whole host of questions coming in. We certainly won't necessarily get to all of them today, but we'll take a look at those we haven't addressed and look at addressing some of those offline. So if Laura and Emily can take a quick look at the new questions that have come in and just familiarize yourself with those. There is a question that I will answer that somebody had actually asked about the Amazon Kindle Fire HD drawing and how that works. Each event we complete, we offer the Kindle Fire HD as a reward for those participating and those completing the survey. Everyone is eligible, no purchase is necessary, and we do that drawing each and every event, and that Kindle Fire will be selected at random and provided to somebody within 2 weeks' time. So that's how that works. So I see a new question here that I'll address maybe to Laura. Laura, considering the current labor tightness in the U.S. Gulf Coast and all the construction plans in the petrochemical industry ahead, do you expect this tightness to slow down the projects, the speed of the projects, and potentially delaying projects to be coming online later?
I think that's a great question. It's certainly something that the industry has a concern about. We have been asked that question a bunch by the chemical industry into IHS. It's something that we're actually still debating. Right now, it has been an issue in the past with other regions of tightness. It could be, but at this point, I think we are expecting, with the market globally not being as tight as it once was, we will see above average growth rates, but you will be able to find the workers somewhere. But it is something we will be keeping an eye on.
Great, thank you. Laura, you also mentioned less difficulty. Oh, looks like we asked that question. I'm sorry. We have a question here for Emily. Emily, how do you think proposed U.S. immigration policies will impact our estimates?
The hot topic as far as the U.S. immigration policy and changes to that is the H-1B visas. And the current plan is to increase the cap, which is at 65,000 to, I believe, 110,000 per year. To put that in perspective, for the 2014 H-1B visas, they opened, I guess, registration or whatever you call it, on April 4th for the 65,000s, and all those visas were filled by April 5th. So within 4 days, all those visas were taken up. So there's no shortness of supply of labor that would like to come to the U.S. to work. I think that the 110,000 will certainly help. A lot of those visas are going towards STEM. A lot are engineering and computer science, so not necessarily the skilled laborers that we would expect on the occupational side. We will see some probably uptick in engineers. But I think the impact will be minimal, especially when you compare this program to how Canada, before there was a bunch of backlash to their policy, how they really streamlined their visas, and also Australia. What's coming with this policy is also a longer posting period for employers will have to post for 30 days, which is slightly longer than what is currently expected, so that kind of increases the backlog or the time to actually be able to bring in a worker. And also one further kind of obstacle is that they are increasing the fees slightly, and then companies that have a high concentration of foreign workers will be disadvantaged, and they're less likely to be able to acquire the H-1B visa permit. So I think it's going to be mixed. Overall, I don't think we're going to see a major positive or negative impact, but it is definitely a question, especially if you're in an industry with a low concentration of foreign workers, to be aware of.
Great, thank you, Emily. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, and we understand that we didn't necessarily answer all of the questions because we received a lot of questions today. The best thing that we would encourage you to do is please indicate in the survey if you have additional questions and your questions were not answered. That might be the best format for you to indicate so send us an additional question offline. Or alternatively, as you'll see on the screen here, you can send us your question at webcasts@ihs.com. And with that, it concludes today's webcast, Global Construction Outlook, Wage Growth, Labor Shortages, and Implications. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd also like to thank our speakers today, Laura Hodges and Emily Crowley of the IHS Pricing and Purchasing Service. The recording of today's event will be posted within 24 hours to the same URL that you used to access today's live event. So in other words, go to the same location that you did to join today's live event, and you will see the on-demand archived version of the event available for replay 24 hours from now at the same location. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, the winner of the Kindle Fire HD will be notified within a 2-week period. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great day. Goodbye.